am so excited today to have on the Hope Matrix Mandy Bird. I have worked with Mandy for so long, and she does such incredible work around grief. And as managing grief is a really important part of getting back to hope. Grief is a feeling that we feel, and if we don't manage it, it can lead to hopelessness, which can ultimately lead to depression. So I'm really grateful to have Mandy here today. How are you?
Oh, hello. Thank you for having me. I am thrilled to be on this podcast with you. I feel so honored and so grateful. Thanks for having me.
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's so good to have you here. And I was thinking today about when we did those videos back in Charlotte, and
Yeah.
we did grief around the holidays. And, we're actually coming up upon the holidays. So it's a great time to be talking about this. So much happening in our world. So many different things that people are grieving about, whether it's things that are happening, or grief from people, or grief from loss of projects. So many different ways we experience grief. So it's great to have you here. So why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself? We'll put your link in our podcasts in your bio, but yeah, can you just give us a
Oh,
little background?
sure. So I'm a licensed psychotherapist, and I've been in private practice coming up on my 30th year. I cannot even believe it's been that long. It's
Wow.
mind blowing to me. And I feel so blessed and so humbled and grateful for truly the hundreds and hundreds of people that I have been fortunate enough and honored to work with through the years. And um, so I think a part of my story of what brought me into grief work really, for many of us, I mean, it was born in my childhood. I mean, when I was a little girl, I had, as so many of us do, I had several big heartbreaks back to back to back. And um, in in those losses and what happened in our family, I felt so alone, so isolated, and in that pain, I can recall being an 8-year-old little girl, literally saying to myself, and the best that I knew how and what I understood God to be, saying, my pain is not going to be in vain. Like those words, an 8-year-old, I don't know where words like that come from as an 8-year-old, but that literally went through my mind. My pain is not going to be in vain. And it was really born in me then that I'm gonna use this heartbreak that I'm feeling so deeply. And I think that's when it was all really put into motion for me, that I knew that I was here to help people with the kind of pain that I was feeling.
Wow, that's amazing for an 8-year-old to kind of get that kind of insight.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, that's, well, I'm not happy for your pain, but I'm glad that you've been able to kind of use it for good. I mean, that's
Yeah.
what I think we all need to do. And we learned a lot about that from Andrew Harvey, or I
Yeah.
did anyway.
Yeah.
So
Me
yeah,
too. Yes.
Chris, yeah.
Yes. Very,
So
very much so.
yeah, so hopelessness, we talk about hopelessness is defined as a feeling of despair and a sense of helplessness. So we feel really horrible, and we feel like we can't do anything about it. And so when we experience grief in the form of losing people, like when I lost my dad, I felt that so bad. I felt that grief, and I felt that that real sense of helplessness. Can you just speak more to that as it relates to grief?
Yes. I think what is so important that um, that your listeners are able to take in is that feeling that helplessness is completely appropriate, that it's totally normal, that we have to bring back the dignity of grieving. I mean, that is one of my of my great furies and frustrations with how we approach mental health overall and how we approach the grieving process in our culture. We lack depth, and in so doing, we minimize the process. So when people are feeling that helplessness, they feel as though there's something wrong with them. And the great message that I want to say, I mean, there's so many things to say about all of this, but that feeling helpless makes sense. Really bringing back the dignity of grieving. It's a part of what is your birthright, your sacred humanity, to feel that helplessness. While it's frightening and at times can even be terrifying, it is a part of the process, because the world as you've known it, whatever your loss is, the world as you've known it has shattered. So of course you're going to feel helpless, and that's so important, that when you're in that kind of pain from loss, that you don't blame yourself for being so truthfully human.
Yeah, amen to that. You know?
So truthfully human, that helplessness. I mean, of course then, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, of course then we want to reach out and get support, but that very beginning, it's such an important question. It's helplessness makes sense, because whether you've lost a job that you've identified with as a big part of who you are, or whether you have a sense of loss of control because of a global pandemic, or whether a relationship has ended, or God forbid, a beloved has died, or you yourself are going through a horrible illness. I mean, whatever your great loss is, it's so human to feel that sense of helplessness when your world has radically shifted.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're so often taught to kind of get back on the horse and get back to life. And I know I was encouraged to go back to school and and I didn't feel that I really had the time to experience that grieving process. I know for me too, I mean, I was young, and so the helpless aspect, I was helpless because I couldn't save my dad. My dad died by suicide. I was
Yeah.
also helpless because I was focused on him being there for me, and I couldn't change
Yeah.
that,
Yeah.
and as I got into that cycle, it led me down a really unhealthy path because I was focused on I was in despair and I was helpless and I kept going in that kind of cycle. So, I mean, what do you think is the best way for us to process grief? And is there, do some people do it better than others, or are there tools we can use?
Sure, sure. I want to add something around the helplessness as we move into this next question, is that one of the things that can aid with that sense of helplessness is over time, and I want to emphasize over time, that it truly is a process. It is not a quick fix, or a button we can push, but over time, as we discover our own authentic being, as we discover who we are, that so it rises up to support us with that sense of helplessness. It's the more, and this is one of the things that grief does. Grief teaches us so much about our own being, and we have to go on the hunt for it. We have to be willing to open up and dive down into our feelings and not avoid our feelings. And as we listen to our grief, we feel our sadness, we feel our anger, we feel our anxiety, the three main feelings of grief. We learn more about who we are, and that helps develop roots deep in our being, and that supports us with helplessness. It also is addressing a fundamental aspect of what helps with the grief journey is being, I mean, there's so many tools we can talk about, but for today, a gem I mean, I'm going to give you rubies and diamonds and emeralds and sapphires and a treasure chest to say to you, do not avoid your feelings. We live in a culture that teaches us to numb our feelings, to deny and minimize our feelings. That is, that is abusive that we're taught that. It's straight up abusive. It's abuse to teach people to not feel. And when we're grieving, the temptation is to, because it hurts so deeply and it's so painful, which makes sense, we want to not feel it because it hurts so badly. And the mystery of all of this is that our feelings are the very thing that we need because they inform us about who we are and what we desire and what we need, and introduces us ultimately to our passion and to our calling, which brings meaning to our lives. So a tool is to affirm our feelings. And by affirm our feelings, I mean just that. Allow them to exist within you. Listen to your anger, to your sadness, to your anxiety. There are practical things we can do, of course, like journal about them. We can go into psychotherapy, which, by the way, if you are someone that chooses to do therapy, make sure your therapist has done their own grief work. And the way you do that is you simply ask them and you say, have you gotten therapy yourself around your own grief story? Have you worked on your own grief journey? Ask that question. That's very essential, that your therapist has done their own inner work around grief and that they welcome the pain of grief in their own lives. So, of course, therapy, of course, support groups, yes to meditation, yes to yoga. There's so many things we can do that are in our popular culture around, tools that we can access. But none of those tools are going to matter if we do not welcome the depth of our feelings, the depth of our feelings. So truly affirming our grief is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, for me, I used to think that my grief would kill me. Like if I felt the amount of pain that I
Yeah,
had in me, that I would die, like that I it would kill me.
yeah.
Literally, I had this belief, and so I, ran to addiction and just whatever would help me feel better in the moment to kind of prolong and avoid a lot of the grief and pain. And I think I mean, and that's what we know around hopelessness too. Hopelessness is predictive of addiction, violence, aggression, partner violence, all kinds of things. So it's really important that we work to process our grief and get through our despair back up to a more positive place.
I mean, it is so human. I mean, with so much empathy, I mean, I feel it in my own body. I mean, it's so human to want to not feel our grief. It makes so much sense. And it's so common to run to addiction. I mean, again, not only is that something that we often personally want to do, but we also do live in a culture that is very invested in numbing out our feelings. Don't feel too deeply, don't get too mad, don't be too sad, don't be too anxious. I mean, we're really taught not to be fully in our what we call creative feelings. And if you notice, I don't call them negative feelings because they're not negative. They're creative, they're life-giving. They teach you about who you are. And what is so understandable is when you're in that much pain to want to numb out, because none of us have been taught, um, from the very beginning, none of us are taught how essential grief is to teaching us who we are. Because it's the paradox. It's both the intensity of grief and the fullness of joy that teach us who we are. Both of those forces teach us who we are. So if we can normalize the grieving process in our own mind. So when I'm working with a client, I say again and again, of course, supporting them in the intensity of their pain, and being with them in that pain, not asking them to minimize it a little tiny bit for me to feel more comfortable. I have to have the courage to sit with them in the intensity of their pain, and at the same time to say, okay, now what is also true about your life that you know? What is also true about the strength of your being that you know? You know, what is also something that brings you joy in your life? What is also something that brings you courage, brings you bravery, brings you hope? Being willing to look at both sides of life, what we call the paradox, gives people a sense of, I can withstand this. It hurts like hell, but I can. And admittedly, there are some losses that wreck us, and that's the truth. And we have to be with that truth also while we're in that sense of deep pain, while we're reaching for life, reaching for the other side, and getting support along the way, because none of us can move through that by ourselves. We're not made to handle this depth of pain on our own. We need support.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get to that too, how to create a network of support. I just want to get back to your the comment about creative feelings. I really like that. I will say that we teach about negative feelings. But when we do that, we talk about more the negative charge of feelings. Not that
Yeah,
negative is a bad thing, not negative in the
right.
bad sense, but just negatively charged. And we know that when we act out when we're in rage or we're in, complete sadness, we're not acting from our more inspired self. So while it's really important to feel those feelings and process them and write about them, if we act out, if we send that email, if we cut that person off in traffic, if we, in that really rageful, angry, hurt state, we don't make the best choices. And so they're really negatively kind of charged feelings, and we have to get back to those positively charged feelings before we take really action or inspired action, at least what we found in the research and what we teach our kids. I do like the thought of creative feelings because it does lead to so much creativity if you can sit in them and really listen to them and listen to what they're telling you.
And I really get, the work and where you are coming from. It makes sense to me when I speak about I don't like the three leading feelings of grief being called negative. It is very much, it's not about the behaviors themselves, because I agree with you. It's when we don't feel our anger that we act out in rage. When we don't allow our grief, we end up in a despairing place. So allowing ourselves to feel, and using tools like, like talk therapy, like journaling, like meditation, like art and music, and running and exercise. I mean, the variety of tools to help us express our feelings, that's what keeps us from moving into, as your work says, those negatively charged behaviors.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it took me a long time to really understand what my feelings were saying. And I mean, it takes for me sitting still. Like if I just start creating but I really have to embody what it is and
Mhm.
understand what they're saying to get a true sense of it. At least that's been true for me for sure.
Mhm. To be able to listen. I mean,
Yeah.
absolutely, I agree that we, to take the time to listen to what are our feelings informing us. What the poet Rumi has an incredible poem, called "The Guest House," and it's all about how our feelings are messengers to us. And I think that is so true, how they inform us about our own being and what we need.
Absolutely. And I think we're also experiencing a kind of collective grief right now, with COVID, with just everything that's happening with the protests and the killings and just the brutality, the inequality. And it is bringing a great sense of hopelessness, really, for many, and despair and mourning of so many things lost. I've personally found myself getting triggered by a lot of things and mourning, even repressed feelings that I haven't thought about for a long time. Is that normal? If you don't process grief as it happens, does it continue to come up over time? And are you forced to eventually kind of deal with it? And can you say anything about really the current environment as well?
Sure, sure. I think that the cost of not being open and honest with our own being, um, not having the courage to feel our grief, if we run away from our wounds, the cost is very, very high. I mean, we store it up in our bodies. The cost is high to us personally, how it affects our health. Truly, it shows up in the body. I mean, science has shown that it, you know, shows up unresolved feelings, end up in stress, which affects the body. And so it affects us personally, and it affects our relationships and those others around us, because we're not accessible, because we have to close a part of ourselves off. So the current culture, what's happening in our country, the things that you named, the political climate that we're in, and what is happening around the world with the global pandemic, because we are global citizens. um, yes, people are triggered left and right. It is a scary time. It triggers us around our sense of um, being out of control in our vulnerability, and triggers for us times in our lives that we felt unsettled, uncertain, frightened, or even abused. And even if you are a person that has done what I would call a lot of inner work, you still may be triggered, understandably, during everything that's going on right now in the world. So it's very normal to do that, and or to experience that. And what I would say is how essential it is that we are gentle with ourselves, we are kind with ourselves, and that we recognize, we can't help it that we get triggered. We can't help that. We can't help what's coming at us, but we can decide and make a choice around what we're going to invest in and how we're going to nurture and care for ourselves when we are triggered. This is also a time that, because the around the US, the COVID numbers are rising, and again, this very tense political climate, um, people are feeling more and more, as depressed. And what I would say again is that how important it is, as we're all grieving these many losses, that we give ourselves a lot of nurturing self care, and that we take care of our feelings like we take care of our physical body. Because this is a very hard time for everyone, and you're not doing anything wrong if you're struggling. It means you're actually a noble-hearted human being that's awake and alive and gives a damn.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, hopelessness is the primary symptom of depression. And again, despair and sense of helplessness. And so we teach our kids to focus on, we do what's called control the controllables. We
Mhm.
really have to focus on what we can control and let
Mhm.
go of what we can't control, and have some
Yeah.
trust. And that is self-care and how we take care of ourselves, nutrition, our sleep, our exercise, getting in nature, voting, changing laws, these kinds of things, connecting with others, because there is a lot we can't control. And if we focus on that, we get very helpless and we get very in despair.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah.
Yeah. So another thing that's common, I mean, in hopelessness and in anxiety and depression is both rumination, and which is, going over and over in your mind things that have happened in the past, which is also
Mhm.
very common with grief, and then worry, which is worrying about the future, very high in anxiety. And so, do you have any tips for dealing with either of those for our listeners?
Yeah. I mean, what I tell my clients first and foremost who are playing over the what ifs in their mind again and again. If I had only done this, if I hadn't have done that, those what ifs, that how normal that is. That in the very beginning stages of moving through the shock of a great loss, that you are going to have some of that. You're going to have some of that, and that you're not doing, again, anything wrong. I think it's so important that we normalize that in the beginning. Some of it can be so overwhelming that some of that ruminating is going to happen, and that's a process that you can move through. A helpful tip with your internal dialogue and self-talk is to practice. And again, sometimes it's 1 hour at a time, but for this hour I'm going to give myself 15 minutes to think about this like crazy. I'm going to think about it, think about it, think about it as much as I need to, and the rest of these 45 minutes it's off limits. And practicing that, it's amazing how practicing that boundary can really help with either the worry about, the ruminating about the past, or the anxiety and worry about the future, to be in the moment with feeling your feelings, feeling your feelings in the moment. That is often very helpful. And I do want to say it makes sense when we're grieving that sometimes we're not able to just stay in the now every moment, because there are things we want in the future, and there's things we're still working through in the past. And what I can say about that is that when we honor our full authenticity, we honor who we are, and we honor both the grief and the joy in our lives, um, we can really handle um, we can handle life overall. We can handle life, we can handle the truth of our lives when we learn that it's okay to feel our grief while we're also going for experiencing big joy.
Yeah, absolutely. Holding them both. I like that.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, and it's interesting too. So that kind of takes me to we teach, the second part of hope is getting from helplessness to inspired action.
Mhm.
So going from you can't do anything to taking action, and setting SMART goals is, it's an evidence-based way to take action. Because
Mhm.
often I just want to feel better. I'm not feeling better, and I get really stuck and I'm not feeling better. But if we can set SMART goals, which are specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time bound, even if our first goal is I'm going to take 15 minutes of today and not spend it, not focus
Yeah.
on them. That is a very specific goal that's achievable. That's something you can kind of make progress with, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that takes us up along the track, which is it's so important to feel that sense of progress and to feel that kind of self-efficacy and control.
And I think it's so helpful for people in the grieving process. I mean, there are a lot of similarities, and in the grieving process, when you go to the grocery store the first time by yourself after your loved one has died, when you repair something in your home. I mean, there's so many examples of those first things where you see yourself achieving, how that helps the individual. And I want to say, around personal self-care and tools, doing things like, I made an appointment with a therapist today. I reached out on an online support group. I mean, just each day, or today, I chose today to be a day that of turtle time, is what I call it. And I was in bed and I had the covers up over my head. And that was my thing I did for myself to rest that day. That also is is a measurable, I'm giving myself that permission to do this day, to nurture and care for myself. um, so yes, there are so many measurable goals that we can do that give us a sense that we're moving along in our grief journey. But what I want to add with the grief journey is that truly there is not a timetable, and that it's so different for each person, and it's different depending on the loss, and the personality style and who the individual is, because while there are similarities in the grieving process, we don't all need the same thing, and that
Yeah.
has to do with our authenticity and who we are.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and things changed, got better, easier for me when I stopped attaching my need to have my dad here, and I thought about what do I really need? What did I get from my dad? What were those benefits of the relationship? How did I feel when I was with my dad? And really focused on those feelings and thinking, okay, now what are different ways that I can meet those needs? Who are
Mhm.
different people that I can connect with, you know? And so it was a process. I mean, we know around hope it's a future orientation, and I had planned on having my dad here, you know, my whole life. And if I get stuck on that, that's kind of a goal and relates to goal theory. If I'm stuck on that and I can't pivot, it's going to really determine how hopeful or hopeless I feel and
Mhm.
am. And so it's the ability to kind of reframe and rethink, you know, what's another way I can meet some of these needs? You know, I'll never have my dad back, but who are other people that I can connect with in this way? So that was really helpful for me.
I've seen so many clients through the years, and people that I know do so many heroic things around the very thing that you're saying. I mean, like, amazing ways to begin caring for their own being. I mean, and that's what you did. And that, I mean, we have to love ourselves enough. We have to choose to love our own being enough. Stop blaming ourselves for the depth of pain we feel, because again, that is so often what people do. They're in so much pain and they blame themselves for the pain that they're in, instead of, this makes complete sense that I would be hurting like this, no matter what our culture is saying. Of course I would be hurting this deeply, and of course I would be hurting for this long. And I want to say it that way again and again, that of course, because you're a beautiful human being with a heart, and the more we keep our heart open, the more we can love. So that was such a courageous thing that you did, to say, okay, my dad can't meet this need for me, but what are some other creative ways? And that's how your grief helped you create. What's another creative way? And I've seen so clients do beautiful things through the years. I mean, I'm thinking about this one woman whose child died of a heart defect that they didn't know the child had. And what she then did, getting involved with other children and creating, um, and giving back through that very need, um, how that, it gave to others, and it so helped her with that need around losing her child in that way.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, Can you tell me a little bit, what can we say in talking about a hope and network, and a network is so important. People deal with grief in different ways. Some people isolate. What can we do to create, if we're grieving, to create a strong network, and then what can we do to support someone that's going through grief?
Yeah. Support is so important. And support isn't going to look the same for all of us. Again, back to our authenticity, I think it's so important that we honor who we are and what we need. So we have to listen to ourselves. Some people are so introverted, um, and are more loner style human beings. So getting them to go to a support group just ain't going to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen. So th- really listening to what we need. I think we all need support, period. Whether, and here we are, in a global pandemic. So we're limited in the ways that we can, physically touch each other and be in each other's presence right now. If you are someone that really enjoys that group dynamic, and I want to say, support groups are amazing in helping you move through your grieving process, because you discover, wait a minute, there really are other people thinking like I am. There really are other people feeling like I am, because so often people feel so isolated and so alone. And so a really wonderful resource online is grieving.com. It's an excellent resource. It's been around for years. It's really credible. Another great resource, in terms of and I'm thinking about, because we're in a pandemic, is grieving anonymously. Is No, it's called Grief Anonymous. That is a huge Facebook group, and these resources are definitely monitored. Um, so I think that what's important, as you're building a network, that you understand that it's essential that you interact with other people that are like-minded, that you don't want to participate with people that minimize your grief, that tell you things like, it all happened for a reason. I mean, those kind of minimizing things are going to make you feel really sad and not seen and not understood. So during a pandemic, reaching out online is a really excellent a way to support yourself. And of course, talk therapy is really, really supportive, and really helpful with people that themselves have done their own inner work. Also, what I would say right now is, when you have the energy, is to educate yourself around the grieving process, because of all of the information that's out there online. There are amazing tools and info where you can normalize your experience by reading a few articles that can support you. Um, I also would say, how to support people that are grieving is that you yourself be willing to feel your own feelings. Some of it is that simple, because how much I can support you, Kathryn, has everything to do with how much I have been willing to do my own grief journey, to feel my own feelings, to be with the truth of my own suffering, has everything to do with how much I can support you. If I minimize my feelings and tell myself to pull myself up by my bootstraps and put on your big girl pants and all those bullshit messages that people say, they make people around you feel horrible. They make them feel not seen, not understood, not heard, isolated, and lonely. Not only are they grieving, but then they're feeling the pain of that isolation, of not being understood. So you can look up, even on Pinterest, no kidding, you can look up on Pinterest tips to support your loved one who's grieving. There are checklists it's amazing the resources that are out there now that weren't available when we were young, but they're out there now. So if you want to support someone, feel your feelings, be empathetic, don't say those ridiculous, bull crap statements that minimize their feelings, and don't ever communicate that it's taken them too long, and educate yourself. Read up on how to support your loved one who's grieving, because there's great information out there.
We're actually just about at the end of our show as it is. And Mandy, I want to thank you so much for sharing all of your brilliance with us. Mandybird.com is where people can find out more information about you. Is there
Yes.
anything else you want people to know before we check off the Hope
Yes.
Matrix for the day?
Yes. I want to say I have a podcast called Finding Hope. It can be found on your local podcast apps, as well as mandybird.com. And I'm also available. I'm doing all kinds of remote grief coaching and grief therapy with people all over the country. So please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to help.
Oh, that's amazing. Mandybird.com. We'll put the info in the podcast description as well. And Finding Hope, the podcast. So be
Yes.
sure to check that out. You've had some
Yeah.
really great guests. And yeah, always so inspiring. I love your energy. You have such a unique way
Thank
of
you.
looking at things. And yeah, such a beautiful way of just embracing people where they are and encouraging
Mhm.
authenticity, which is, so important that we're all kind of doing these days. And you're really good at helping
Yeah.
bring that out in people and supporting their
You.
process.
Thank you for
Yeah.
having me. What a
Yeah,
blessing.
thanks for being on. And thank you, all of you listeners, for joining us today on the Hope Matrix. It was great to have you here. We hope you learned something and hope this supported you in some way. Have a great rest of your day and week.